Hi, welcome to Neuroverse, a podcast hosted by Carolina
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond. Welcome back to another episode of Neuroverse, and today we're celebrating our
third.
Oh my gosh. Our 3rd year anniversary. That is on Valentine's Day. And so to commemorate that, we are dedicating yet another episode to love. Last year we did Love on the Brain. And this year we are expanding that to talk about why we love. So to start us off, I thought we would maybe discuss a little bit about what the philosophers had to say back in the day.
Of course, it's always a good idea to start with the philosophers.
Yeah, like setting the scene. So starting off with Schopenhauer, who in his The World as Will and Representation discussed how there are different grades of the will's objectification. So basically at the lowest level, the will is objectified by natural forces like the force of gravity, and in living beings this is extended to manifest as a will to life and the desire to cling on to an existence. And then as you go higher up in, I guess, complexity of the self, the will's manifestation expresses itself in even more complex ways, and Schopenhauer claimed that the highest degree of the will's manifestation is found in humans, and this consists of the experience of love. He also, weirdly, had a very biological account of love, despite that sounding very metaphysical, as he thought that the experience of falling and being in love is completely irrational and based solely on our wanting to produce offspring with a lover. And so he viewed romantic love as a biological trick that pushes us towards certain people with the aim of procreating, saying that reproduction is the ultimate purpose of every organism and its strongest instinct. So I guess it's related to the will in that the will is not really something you can control. And expanding on this, Nietzsche also agreed that love is an instinctual force that is related to our biological drivers. And this was clearly illustrated in his Aphorism 14, where Nietzsche claims that it is the urge to possess and assimilate, to change something new into ourselves, that is behind the experience of both love and greed, which also kind of highlights the lack of control we have over love.
And maybe the selfishness as well, given the greed.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, and Nietzsche wrote, "Greed and love, what different feeling these two terms evoke. Nevertheless, it could be the same instinct that has two names."
Although I kind of disagree with him.
Yeah.
Like, I think love is inherently selfless and respectful towards the other person, whereas greed, I think, comes from a place of control and jealousy. And actually, in our last episode, you recommended me and the listeners this book, The Mastery of Love.
Yeah.
And they talk about love in that sense, and I really love that book, by the way.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, and so to that, I disagree with Nietzsche.
But yeah, no, I definitely see what you mean. I think love in its best form is selfless, but love in many of its forms is greedy. Yeah, it's hard to draw the line, though. But like, for example, you mentioned jealousy, which I also want to expand on more later, but is considered selfish. And that is something that you could say inevitably occurs to a certain level with love. It's also like how we should aspire to have unconditional love. Yeah. But realistically, how often is that achieved? That would be selfless, but often love is not unconditional. Yeah. And often love is not selfless. But I agree with you that I don't particularly like Nietzsche's depiction of love, and it doesn't really encourage a good way of love. Yeah. But what I do like is what Robert Solomon said in The Virtue of Love. And this is related to the relation between love and morality. So Solomon claimed that ultimately there is only one reason for love. That one grand reason is because we bring out the best in each other. And I really like this quote because I agree with it in an idealistic sense.
Yeah, I also agree with it, definitely.
So this kind of sets the scene for the episode, because what I want to discuss is to what extent love has a biological basis, and specifically in humans, what the purpose of love is. And this brings us to the comparison between evolutionary forces and sociocultural forces. So I did a little bit of research into the evolution of love, and it turns out there are several psychologists who've written on this topic, and I personally did not really enjoy reading about this because I thought that it just very much reduced love to something stereotypical, in that it, first of all, it only comments on heterosexual relationships.
Yeah.
And secondly, I think a lot of the literature is kind of like saying this is what we can observe about love, and that can fit the evolutionary framework. So I think there's some truth in it, but there's more to it than just the evolutionary aspects, which I'll get into. But if we do try to look at love from an evolutionary perspective, this would be by saying that love is an adaptation designed to solve specific problems of survival and reproduction, as the psychologist David Buss put it. And so it's the idea that humans in particular, being social creatures, require love to survive and reproduce optimally.
Yeah, I really resonated with what you said about researching on the evolution of love and it being quite, stereotyped, as you said. The main thing that I came across when I was researching into the evolution of love was always this depiction about, we can look at mammals that breastfeed their babies, and therefore that shows like a motherly infant bond, and that's evidence for where love in humans comes from. And I think that it's interesting that that's the main example that they refer to when there are many other types of love. And also in terms of society, like it's not just the mother feeding the baby. Oftentimes, women would be in tribes or in groups, and we would benefit from help from each other. And so there's a bigger cultural and social aspect to it.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, I also noticed this recurring theme of different types of love being kind of grouped together, and I agree that the parent-infant bond is quite a different form of love from like romantic love or passionate love, although there are links, as we've also discussed in our previous episode, relating to attachment theory. But what I do find interesting is, as you said, the sociocultural context makes such a big difference, and modern humans do live in tribes, even though if nowadays we're very isolated from one another. But the evolutionary approach to looking at love within humans therefore must take that into account. And so when we think about the evolution of love in humans, it is definitely going to have to be in the context of living in a society. And this kind of logically makes sense why love presents itself in the form of monogamous relationships in general within humans, because for many other animals, monogamous relationships is not going to enhance their reproductive capacity. But for humans, we require such a long period of raising a child that having other carers there, as you mentioned, is really crucial to ensure survival of offspring. And some may argue that love is an evolved solution to the problem of commitment. So say that everyone is on the lookout for a partner, and they're all looking for these optimal qualities, and the moment that their partner shows any signs of weakness, or they find somebody else that has whatever is lacking, then they'll move on. Well, that may sound like reality, but if in its extreme form of people leaving each other the moment they find something better, that will lead to chaos, and no one will end up in relationships, right?
Yeah,
like, you get what I mean.
I definitely get what you mean. And I mean, I feel like that sounds like dating in 2024, 2025.
As I'm saying this, I'm also thinking, maybe we're also moving towards that a little bit more.
And it's also, we are spoiled for choice.
Yeah, but the solution that can overcome that is the concept of commitment. Because if you are nonetheless committed to your partner, then you won't just leave the moment that something better appears, because you have so many other factors to take into account, like the history you have with this person and the memories you've shared, etc. And so in that way, love would ensure that you will not leave someone when someone more desirable comes along. So, linked to this view that love is a solution that evolved to the problem of commitment, comes in jealousy, which is, as I mentioned, sort of an inevitable consequence of love. And indeed, it was found in a 1994 study that 46% of people stated this. So, around 50% of people agree that jealousy is natural when it comes to true love. And this begs the question, is jealousy good or bad in a relationship?
Yeah.
And does this emotion that often comes together with love assist the purpose of love? And an interesting study in 1986 addressed this by asking a sample of unmarried but romantically involved men and women to complete a jealousy test. And then they followed up 7 years later and contacted those participants to ask them about their current status. And they found that around a quarter of these couples got married, whereas around 3/4 were no longer together. And those that got married had an average jealousy score of 168, but those who were no longer together had an average jealousy score lower of 142.
Okay.
And though this study had quite a small sample, I thought it was a very interesting longitudinal one that suggests that potentially jealousy might actually be a good thing, fitting in with the sort of evolutionary perspective of love. So obviously, there's a gradient of jealousy that can be had. It would have been interesting to look at like the extreme cases.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure jealousy is not a good thing once it like surpasses a specific limit.
Yeah.
But a little bit of it might do the trick.
Yeah, I mean, I personally don't agree that jealousy is a good thing.
At all.
Yeah. I mean, I just think that for me, jealousy means that the person doesn't trust the other person. And therefore, if you don't have trust, then what do you have, you know? And as I mentioned earlier, I think jealousy, it stems from a place of control and insecurity. So I do think that, you know, it's oftentimes just a projection. It's oftentimes a warped perception of reality. And I don't think it's healthy.
Yeah, no, I definitely understand that. And I think it depends how you define jealousy, of course. But I do see how it could be healthy in the sense of like, it's a normal feeling to not want a partner, and if you're in a committed relationship, to be with someone else.
Yes, of course.
And you can't, like, I don't think that it's healthy to deny that. But
Yeah.
obviously, if it's then coming from a selfish place, and one that is making negative assumptions about your partner and trying to be controlling, then that's definitely
Okay.
negative.
Yeah, in my definition, like, not wanting your partner to be with someone else, that doesn't count as jealousy. Like, that's crossing a boundary.
Oh, okay, well then that clears it up. That's where we differ.
Okay.
Because I would consider that jealousy. Like,
Really?
healthy jealousy, yeah. It's not that your partner necessarily has to do it, but like, the thought of that makes you uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I would consider that jealousy.
Yeah, I don't know what I would categorize that, but I wouldn't categorize it as jealousy.
But then moving away from the evolutionary perspective and coming back more into the socio-cultural context, I read a paper by Karen Dion and Kenneth Dion, which I find so funny because in the last episode, I noticed when researching the topic of love that a lot of papers were written by couples. And I had never seen it as much in other fields. And again, I found this paper, Individualism, Collectivism, and the Psychology of Love, which I found fascinating because it commented on how different systems of belief about culture and the relation between the individual and the group can really impact your perception of love. And they emphasize that in order to understand love, we really need to understand this cultural context, because we need to understand how love is understood by people. And of course, when it comes to love, the depiction is mainly a westernized one. and Western societies tend to be ones that enforce individualism. So let me explain. In societies where individualism prevails, such as Western societies, marriage based on romantic love is more likely to be endorsed. Whereas in collectivistic societies, a larger proportion of young adults say that they would marry a person with whom they were not in love, as long as the person had other qualities that they wished for. And Dion explained this as being caused by when individualism prevails, romantic love is seen as an opportunity for self-discovery, self-expression, and thus love being a basis of marriage follows. Yeah, kind of paradoxically though, individualism on the psychological level can make it more difficult to conform with culturally desired love-based marriage. And this has been shown across several studies that people who report more self-contained individualism, meaning they have qualities like they prioritize personal freedom and autonomy, and they value self-sufficiency, these sorts of qualities, they have a lesser likelihood of reporting that they have been in love before. And they also have more negative experiences of love. And so overall, greater individualism on the personal level is related to more negative attitudes towards marriage.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That reminds me a little bit of a quote that I read by Aristotle, where he said that he who is unable to live in society or who has no need because he is self-sufficient for himself must be either a beast or a god. So either an animal that is completely independent or an all-powerful being. And we are neither, or maybe somewhere in the middle. But yeah, I read a lot about how we are relational beings, and so like we are persons by others because we are born and raised by the families and live with the influence of relatives, neighbors, and friends. But we are also persons with others because we can become ourselves in the company of our friends or our loved ones. And we are also persons for others. When we are able to overcome our self-centered tendencies and love others or care for others. And I found this really interesting, and also that instinct that, going back to, let's say, infant-parental relationships, when a child is hurt, it looks for the parent for confirmation, like in the facial expressions. And so, yeah, I find it interesting how, even though, as you mentioned, in the Western society, it's quite individualistic, we still can't deny the fact that we are relational beings and that we're not lone wolves. We can't just be on our own. And I also heard about these studies done in the 70s where they told parents to not make any facial expressions to the infants. Usually when an infant laughs or something, the parent also smiles and laughs back, and there's like mirroring happening. But they did these studies where they asked the mothers not to react emotionally, and that was really distressing for the baby. And so even at such a young stage, we mirror each other, and we are relational beings, like I said.
Yeah, I like that you're highlighting the importance of like social interactions for development. Because it's true that our social interactions early on really helps inform our future perspectives and experiences of love as well. And I agree that like reading this highlighted to me the disadvantages of individualism, and the fact that it's not only that there's a negative consequence for others, that you are less likely to engage in love, but that the negative consequences are really on yourself if you're unable to have a positive experience of love. And in contrast to that, there's collectivism, which is very much what you described on the basis of being relational beings. And it was found that psychological collectivism, so personal attitudes valuing relationships with others rather than relying on self-sufficiency, this was associated with viewing love being based on friendship, altruistic and agapic goals, which to me is what love should be more like, rather than a more selfish, individualistic view of love being for your own benefit and self-growth. Which I have to admit, I feel like I have a bit of both. No, it's just that I also like come from a mixed culture of being half Western and half Eastern, and therefore understanding individualism and collectivism and having a bit of both, I guess. At least at the societal level. And then, I think on the psychological level, I also like share a bit of both for that reason. But this highlighted to me that your perception of yourself is the main driver of your perception of love, of how you understand love. Like your perception of yourself in relation to others, more specifically. Because it defines what you kind of seek in love and in relationships. Just to summarize this point, it's really that if the self is conceptualized as being separate from others, as is the case in individualism, then a function of love it would be to create bonds with others, break down the sense of isolation inherent in the view of the self. Whereas if the self emerges in the context of a network of relationships, as is the case in collectivism, then there should be less of an emphasis on forming and maintaining a connection, but instead an emphasis on behaviors that acknowledge and support the presence of a bond that's already assumed to exist. And what I really like is that they say this one sentence that really resonated with me, that theories about the psychology of love are themselves cultural constructions. Because it's all dependent on what the culture kind of aspires towards. Yes, but regardless of these cultural differences, based on different societal values, love is still universal. Something that I found when reading these quite old psychology and sociology papers is that apparently people used to think that love is not universal, which I find ridiculous.
No, but I remember in our last episode we spoke about Helen Fisher and how in her research she found love is present, or like described to be present in about 140 different cultures. So but it's just crazy to me that sometime people thought that like less modern cultures didn't have love. Like I feel like I always assumed that existed. Me too. But yes, and not only do people all around the world love, but studies interviewing people across European, Filipino, Japanese ancestry found that men and women from various ethnic groups also loved with equal passion. So it's also not that like these sociocultural differences may influence to what extent we love either. Okay, so kind of linking back to what you said earlier about infant-parent bonding, I was then interested in what sort of biological aspects may have evolved that could regulate this universal love that we share, despite our attitudes being different based on sociocultural factors. And one theory proposed by Bowlby. So John Bowlby is a famous psychologist who came up with attachment theory that suggests that how infants form close relationships with their caregivers affects their social and emotional development. And Bowlby proposed that this attachment system actually evolved in primates as a means to give offspring a better chance at surviving into adulthood. And this is also mirrored in the fact that lovers interact with one another in ways that mimic parent-infant bonding. Lovers, for example, use baby talk when they converse, and they use their favorite nicknames on one another, and they engage in close physical contact, and they are sensitive to each other's motives and needs, which are all characteristics that feature in infant-parent bonds. And so he suggests that evolution may have borrowed in a way these bonding mechanisms and applied them to the context of romantic pair bonding. Okay, why is it that it's applied to romantic pair bonding but not with like friendship, love? Right, and I think that's because these are like our core relationships in life. If we're talking about like romantic monogamous relationships that aspire to become a long-term relationship potentially for having children, etc., then
that is going to be sort of your core relationship in life that replaces your previously core relationship in life, which was that with your caregiver. Whereas friendship, love definitely exists, but it's potentially not a core relationship.
Yeah.
So, but what I find interesting about the attachment system is the neurobiological basis, which I don't think is fully understood, but a major chemical that we know is implicated in this is oxytocin, which we also, of course, described in our previous love episode. And this is because the effects of oxytocin in pair bonding has been well established across many studies, and oxytocin is known to have a major role in engaging in social behaviors in general. For example, romantic partners that were exposed to oxytocin displayed more positive communication during conflict discussions. And men in committed relationships that were exposed to oxytocin then viewed their partners as being more attractive and standing further away when interacting with an attractive female stranger, suggesting oxytocin may sort of promote this like commitment-like behavior that we think love may have evolved for. Okay, so then I went on to research. I wanted to find out what is the evolution of oxytocin. And I found this paper that did a comprehensive genomic analysis of oxytocin across several species. And they found that there is this gradual evolution of oxytocin genes, where I can redirect you to the paper for the full details. But the key findings were that around 18% of oxytocin genes had their earliest homologous protein sequence dating back to like 3,500 million years ago, so really, really, really ancient, suggesting that the oxytocin pathway is evolutionarily ancient. However, only 1/5 of these genes seem to have originated in jawed vertebrates, which is a category we as humans belong to. And most importantly, when they then looked at where in the human body oxytocin genes were expressed, they found that genes from the modern gene set were upregulated in skeletal muscle tissue and the brain, whereas those from a medium-aged gene set that was evolutionarily older were upregulated in blood vessels in the bladder, and so partake in different functions. But these modern genes supporting the oxytocin system were upregulated not only in the brain but also in certain cortical regions, which are areas that we think have higher order functions, including that of social behaviors. So that's a very vague overview of the results of the study, but I found it fascinating that indeed the evolution of oxytocin may have implications for our social behaviors as humans, and that includes love.
Yeah, that's super interesting. When researching this, I also came across like a couple interesting facts about some animals and their expression of love in relation to their infants. So they found that in about 200 million years ago, in the latest Triassic and earliest Jurassic periods, they found fossils of this proto-mammal who was a mother that died protecting 38 of her tiny babies.
How did they know?
They know it was a female, and it died in a way that it was protecting her babies.
Oh, okay.
But it's interesting that other primitive animals, such as lizards, aren't parental at all. So like Komodo dragon abandons their eggs and leaves the hatchlings to fend for themselves, and if she ever does meet her young, she eats them. So if they see her, they run away. And so that thing that you were saying,
that would be horrible.
Yeah.
Like, the moment that you're born, you have to run away from your own parent.
I know. So that thing that you were saying about the evolutionary split was really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And not only is oxytocin involved in these behaviors, but so is another famous neurotransmitter, dopamine. So I wasn't surprised to find, when I was researching the evolution of oxytocin, a paper on dopamine's role in the development of human social intelligence. I thought, wow, okay, this is going to be useful. So I went to read the paper, and what they did is they looked at the expression of dopamine precursors in brain tissue of humans and other apes and monkeys and compared the expression. And dopamine is particularly highly expressed in a brain region known as the basal ganglia, and part of that is the striatum, where dopamine is thought to have a role in rewarding behaviors, goal-directed behaviors, as well as responding to social and environmental cues and maintaining behavioral flexibility. And they found that humans had dramatically more dopamine in their striatum than apes. So the striatum is also classically divided into the dorsal and ventral striatum, which have different functions, and the ventral striatum is actually more involved in the sort of social behaviors, but they were only able to look at the dorsal striatum based on the samples that they had access to. So we don't know if this is also the case for the ventral striatum, but nonetheless, they also found that humans and apes had more serotonin in the striatum compared to monkeys. And other studies in humans have shown that striatal serotonin levels are positively correlated with the degree of cognitive control over our emotions, linking it with social intelligence. So this could contribute to the enhancement of what we call social intelligence in humans and apes compared to monkeys. And finally, they also looked at a third neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, and found that humans had less acetylcholine than gorillas and chimpanzees, and this is a neurotransmitter linked to dominant and territorial behaviors. And so overall, the human-specific signature of neurotransmitters in the striatum could provide support that we are more sensitive to social cues, and these differences in dopamine, serotonin, and acetylcholine could encourage more social conformity and affiliative behavior rather than aggressive behaviors. And the authors say that this could favor provisioning and monogamy in emergent hominids, which I think mirrors what we've been talking about this whole episode of the evolution of love favoring longer-term committed relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So now that we've established that the evolution of neurotransmitter systems could support the biological basis of the evolution of love, I also wanted to end by talking about coming back to the central question of why we love, how love can actually benefit our lives as well. Of course, most of our listeners would have personal experiences with this, hopefully, of how love can benefit your life. But I also found some evidence that married people are generally happier and more satisfied with life than those who had never married, were widowed, or divorced, despite the fact that I feel like the circling belief is marriage makes you unhappy. But nonetheless, studies have shown that married people in general are happier. Also, one particularly interesting study basically took happily married women and they gave them electric shocks while their brains were being scanned in a MRI experiment. And in one condition, the woman was left alone, and in two other conditions, the women held the hand of either their husband or a male experimenter stranger. And they found that physical contact with the hand of their husband led to the electric shocks being perceived as less painful, which supports the calming effects of a marital partner,
Nice.
Which is promising.
Yeah.
And in a meta-analytic review, looking at loads of studies, 126 published articles over 50 years that described the association between marital relationship quality and physical health in over 72,000 individuals, they found that there was, as expected, considerable heterogeneity across studies, but that greater marital quality was related to better physical health overall, as well as lower pain-related disability, better self-rated health, and a lower risk of early mortality. Interestingly, it was also found that greater marital quality was related to having lower cardiovascular reactivity during marital conflict discussions. I guess what is highlighted here is that it's not whether you're married or not, but it's how happy you are in your relationship, and that this is going to positively benefit your life.
Yeah, I do find it really convincing, these studies, and how being in a happy relationship and the quality of your relationship affects your overall quality of life. And when I was reading about the relational aspect of being humans, I was also interested in the philosophy aspect of certain things, in that there are relational goods such as friendships or relationships that can't be enjoyed alone, and that ties back into the individuality aspect of things that we were talking about, and how the interaction between personals can give rise to interpersonal affection expressed in feelings and mental states and attitudes, but also how it's not just about people. It can also be things like nature. So there are human to nature relationships, and humans use nature as other animals do to obtain food and protect themselves and acquire habitats. And also there is the human relationship that people form sometimes with deities or spirituality, and so that there's mainly 3 different levels of human relationalness, in that there is this major one which is about relationships and love and friendships and parental love, but then I'm also very interested in, I guess, the love in a way humans have for nature or for a spiritual connection. And so, yeah, there are many facets, and I wonder what the evolutionary roots are for our desire to have these relationships. I think the nature one is quite self-evident, but a lot of humans also have a belief in a deity, and if not in a deity, in some type of spirituality. Yeah.
I think an interesting idea in response to that is that our social structures may have informed the development of our ability to love, and that then could be taken beyond the realms of our interpersonal relationships and into the world. That may not be how it happened, but based on what we've spoken about today, well, I quite like that hypothesis, I guess. But yeah, no, I definitely agree. Like, I always like thinking about love in terms of all the different forms of love, and not only like romantic relationships or even human relationships. But as we spoke about, this reminded me of the episode we did with Sophie Scott on laughter. And we were speaking about how like laughter is quite human specific, and even in our very close relatives like chimpanzees, there isn't much laughter among even relatives or, you know, familiar mates. And we kind of came to the conclusion that it may be because humans are essentially not living in flight or fight mode as much. And so we have a greater capacity to kind of relax and share positive emotions and express things like laughter and love and compassion. So from that perspective, combined with like what we were saying about the biological basis of these social behaviors being like having developed over evolution, probably with the stressor being that social structures helps us survive as humans. So from that, I kind of can conceptualize how the pressure to survive has driven us to be social, which has driven our like neurobiological systems to develop in a way that promotes pro-social behavior, which has driven our ability to love and express compassion and other positive emotions. That has then driven us to be able to share love with other animals and the planet, which I see as quite a human specific thing, because even though we completely destroy it most of the time, we are capable of loving nature and expanding our sense of self through the means of love.
Yeah.
So I hope you enjoyed today's episode on why we love, and please tell us what you think about this topic, comment on the episode, and be sure to give us a follow on Instagram at Neuroverse_pod. If you want to find out more about Neuroverse, check out our website, neuroversepod.com. Thank you so much for listening.